All right, so I thought I would just talk a little bit about some of the unintended effects of biofuels, issues related to measuring those effects, and the effectiveness of policies to try to address those effects. So we've sort of heard today about all the promise that bioenergy offers, low carbon, renewable, energy security, compatible with existing infrastructure, and also brings high value uses for low value land or even for otherwise low value crops like corn and so on. So there's a lot of promise, there's a lot of excitement about bioenergy. One of the challenges, of course, is the high cost of producing, converting it to biofuel particularly, or even trying to displace coal with it, and so that's what necessitates policy support. But in addition to the fact that it needs this policy, there's a lot of concerns about about converting land from food and feed and fiber to fuel production. When you're looking at agricultural feedstocks, there's this food versus fuel debate, the effects on food prices, which happened in sort of 2008, 2009, that has spurred this concern, the potential that it will lead to conversion of non-crop land to crop production, so changes at the extensive margin with possibly forests being converted or grasslands and so on being converted to agricultural production. And then the reason it also becomes important is because that means there's a release of carbon stocks, it creates a carbon debt, and that can offset some of the benefits of displacing gasoline and coal with biofuels. On the forest biomass side, there's sort of similar concerns, but in addition to that, there's the fact that these forests, when you're looking at trees, they're long rotation, take 25 to 50 or even more years to grow, and so you cut down the trees and then they take time to reabsorb the carbon, and during that time you've added more carbon to the atmosphere. And in addition to that is all the same indirect effects, because it might lead to deforestation or changes in land use and so on. On the fuel market side, there's the unintended effect is that there could be a rebound in the fuel market, because when you have large-scale displacement of gasoline, for example, by biofuels, it can have a negative impact on the world fuel prices, and that leads to increased fuel consumption that can again offset the benefits of displacing gasoline in the U.S. with biofuels. Okay, so there's been a lot of there's a lot of press on this. There's a lot of literature on this, and basically that there's a lot of mixed evidence really on the magnitude of the indirect effects. And but nevertheless, it has sort of fueled this adverse perceptions about bioenergy, and it's also led to policy to try to address these. And so one of the things I want to talk about is what are the implications and what are the hidden costs of the current efforts and the policy that's trying to regulate these indirect land use effects. Okay. So there's a lot of sort of the papers trying to on a variety of these trying to sort of quantify these effects, and some of these you can look at. For example, there's evidence that the Conservation Reserve Program in the U.S. has been declining in terms of the acreage, and that has been declining since 2007. We've lost about 10 million acres of land in the Conservation Reserve Program. A lot of that has happened at the same time as biofuel production or corn ethanol production increased after 2007, and so by association there's the implied effect that that's been caused because of higher food prices, which made it more profitable for land to leave CRP. So that's sort of on the one hand. If you look at other studies which point out that the opposite evidence, which show that in fact the blue line shows the changes in total acreage, cropland acreage over time in the U.S. The red line shows the changes in returns to land over that same time period. And basically this paper argues that actually land use is very inelastic to crop price changes or returns or changes in the returns to land. Even though the returns to land sort of increased by 58% between 2004 and 6 to 2007-9, which is a time when biofuel production was really taking off, land use changed very little. And so at the extensive margin, land does not respond as much to price changes as one might think, and therefore this whole indirect land use change effect is a little bit overrated. There are, models have been used to try to estimate this effect and to simulate what the effect of, say, a shock in biofuels would do to land use change, and estimates vary across these studies, with some, finding a large effect, for example, the Searchinger study, to others finding a much smaller effect, but still finding a fairly, a range of about 4 to 6 million hectares of land being changed because of this 15 billion gallon shock of corn ethanol that, was expected to take place. Okay. And then that translates into a great deal of variability in what that means in terms of the grams of CO2 that are released as a result of this indirect effect. So that's, and that varies tremendously across studies, with the earliest studies sort of saying it's 104 grams of CO2 per megajoule, and that's just the indirect effect, and not the direct effect of producing the corn ethanol itself, but just the indirect effect due to land use change. And then as the models have improved, those estimates have come down, and I think currently they're down to about like 10. So there's been a steady decline in the estimate of this indirect land use change, but of course that public perception once formed is really hard to change. Okay. So, why is it so challenging to estimate this indirect land use change, and why, despite so much of research, why does there continue to be so much of uncertainty? And in large part, it's because, for one thing, it's not something that can be observed and actually measured, because it requires being able to compare an observed reality of land use change with a counterfactual reality, a counterfactual of what land use would have been if you did not have any biofuels. And so in order to construct that counterfactual, which is unobserved, you have to rely on models to be able to do that simulation. Models are based on a number of different assumptions, and in this kind of case, we're really talking about being able to simulate changes across a chain of events that starts with the shock of biofuel production occurring, and then how that affects food crop production, and that affects land use change, and that leads to changes in the world market, and transmits that into world food prices, and then those get transmitted into land use change in other countries across the globe, and then converting all of that into release of carbon stocks in those countries that are stored in forests or other vegetation. And related to all this is the question of what time horizon is being taken into account when you're trying to figure out how long it'll take to pay back that carbon debt that gets created. If you take a long time period, your annualized numbers will be much smaller. If you take a shorter time period, they'll be much larger. So there's, given all of those assumptions, as those assumptions change and as they've been getting better over time, the estimate of that indirect land use change has fallen. But one of the issues with these models, of course, is it's very hard to validate. Many of these models are not exactly validated, and so there's questions about how well they're depicting the reality. They typically tend to take the static view of a single one-time shock of 15 billion gallons. And then there's issues of how well they're capturing these dynamics of yield growth over time, as well as which would kind of represent these intensive margin effects. Do you really have to have the kind of extensive margin effects that these models are predicting, or is there likely to be some mitigation because yield growth might take place over time? And then the question of which type of land is being considered for conversion. When there is an increase in prices, is forest land likely to be converted, or is idle land likely to be converted first? And so depending on those kinds of assumptions, you can get a variety of results in terms of the net impact. Okay. So we tried to take a shot at trying to see what might happen if we were to use a model that we have been working with for a while, and see whether, what kind of estimates we would come up with in trying to understand the impacts of corn ethanol production over the last 6-7 years. And so I won't go into the details of the model, but this is it's a integrated model of the ag, forestry, and transportation sectors. It's a dynamic model, so it looks at changes happening over time. and it determines what happens when you impose a particular demand for corn ethanol, for example, over time. You can look at what the implications are for land use change, prices, quantities, and so on. So what we did with this was we simulated the impact of this increase in corn ethanol that we've seen over the period 2007 to 2012, almost going up from about 6 billion gallons to around 13 billion gallons. And at the same time, we had data on the CRP acres. On a county-by-county basis, we knew how much CRP acres were expiring from each county and how many re-enrolled in the CRP and how many left CRP and went into crop production. So we used that to calibrate our model, and then we run the model and we validated our results to see how well our model was able to predict the reduction in acreage in CRP as a result of this corn ethanol production over time. And so the graphs on the right show the blue bars are the reported data, and then the red bars are what the model predicted in terms of the decline in CRP. And as you can see, it comes out to be actually fairly close. The charts on the right show the percentage deviation between the model simulation and the observed, and it's about 3 to 5% or so. So we felt pretty confident about the model's ability to predict changes in land use given in response to this price change, in response to the biofuel production shock. And so when we do that, what we found was that over this period, about 7.3 million acres of land, the conversion of that from marginal acres, and that's not just CRP, but also land which is in cropland pasture, idle fallow in the US, could in fact be attributed to corn ethanol production. But this represents about 30 to 40% of the total land that actually converted over this period. So not all of the land and all of the reduction in CRP could actually be attributed to corn ethanol, but about 30 to 40%, and that the range is what it varied over time over the 6 years that we looked at, but that's sort of typically what could be attributed to corn ethanol. But equally sort of interestingly was we found that as the corn ethanol production increased, the amount of land that this indirect land use change effect was actually increasing, but at a declining rate. And so so you see this sharp increase in corn ethanol over this time period, and then the dashed line showing that land use change was occurring, but at a much slower rate. So in terms of the amount of land that was being converted per gallon of ethanol, that amount was declining, and that went from about close to 250 acres per million gallons down to about 251 to about 108 acres per million gallons, a number which is significantly smaller than what's been estimated by previous studies, and it's also much smaller than what you would get if you were to just take this one-shot view of what does it take to produce 15 billion gallons, and not recognize that in fact this is a much it's a dynamic process. It's also one where so land use change is occurring gradually, and some of that land is being reused again and again to produce biofuels over time. So it's not just a one-time effect, but it's really a dynamic effect. And when you do that, you find that the effects are much smaller than would have been thought otherwise. Moving on to looking at sort of forest bioenergy. In the case of forest bioenergy, when we think about the greenhouse gas implications of using forest bioenergy, there's of course this direct effect that you're taking you're producing the trees, you're harvesting them, transporting them, all of which requires energy. So that's the direct energy that would be spent in harvesting trees to use as for bioenergy. But in addition to that, the trees kind of lead to this thing of biogenic effect, their biogenic effect, which is not the case in these annually harvested and grown agricultural feedstocks, but becomes relevant in the case of forest bioenergy. And that arises because trees store carbon that is released when they're combusted. It takes a long time to regrow. And so it's not it's a little bit harder to make the case that this is all recycled contemporaneous carbon, because you're storing carbon and then releasing it and then restoring it. So that needs to be considered when you're looking at forest bioenergy. And then in addition to that is the indirect effects, and those arise because, again, you're diverting forest biomass from traditional products like paper and packaging and lumber and saw timber and so on, and using that for bioenergy. It can, or that can cause increased harvesting to meet those needs, as well as changes in land use. There may be increased planting of forest land in order to meet this demand in the future, or there may be greater clear cutting and deforestation. So it depends on which of those effects and incentives work. There could be land use change associated with that. And then, of course, we've been exporting a lot of pellets from the US to the EU in recent years. There's also concern about how much of transportation emissions are going into shipping sort of low density type of fuel across the Atlantic. So, and Tom sort of talked about this earlier in his presentation. But the standard view of this whole forest bioenergy, okay, I'm going to wrap up quickly. The standard view has been that you have this carbon debt when you cut down the trees, and then it takes time for the carbon to regrow, and so you have this debt and dividend. There's also the view that in the other graph there, that in fact these trees, if you weren't to cut them, would continue to grow and sequester carbon. And now when you start cutting them on a regular basis for forest bioenergy, you create this debt, which again is going to take a long time to pay. But that's sort of very different from really the way that another view that you could take of forest, of using forest biomass, which is more of a landscape view. So it's not this temporal view, but it's more of a spatial view of the forest, which is that really forests are being managed continuously, pretty much like a rotation. So if you have a 25-year-old forest, you're going to be harvesting a portion of the forest every year in order to meet your demands for your industry, and it's going to be growing, and you're cutting one portion of it, and the rest, and another portion is growing, and you've got a forest at the various stages of growth. So if you take this landscape view of the forest, you don't actually have this debt and dividend effect to the same extent. And so that the whole biogenic carbon, the extent to which you really need to take that into account, depends on which view of forest management you're taking, and also how the forest management is occurring. So that's sort of one thing that factors into really measuring that unintended effect. The other is that while one typically thinks that demand for forest biomass is going to lead to clear cutting and deforestation, most of this, again, if you're thinking about commercially managed forests, these are privately owned, and industry is not likely to sort of deforest their capital for immediate gains. There is equal incentive for them to actually bring in more land into forestry in order to meet future demand. So when there is an increased demand in the future, there is incentive to maintain land in forest, to in fact convert land from other uses to forest. And so one has to take those dynamics into account as well in thinking about what the net impact on carbon stocks is going to be. And so again, this is some work that we had done where we kind of took into all of those factors into account. And at the end, depending upon various scenarios and assumptions and so on, come up with a result that compared to coal-based electricity, in which it would, if you were to send pellets produced in the U.S. South, ship it to Europe, you get a reduction in greenhouse gas intensity per megajoule somewhere between sort of 70 to 80%. And of course, indirect effects actually add on to the direct effect in terms of the greenhouse gas intensity, and it's about 11 to 26%. So in the case of pure forest biomass, indirect effects make up about a 26% additional amount of the greenhouse gas intensity, but still after that, there's still a significant benefit in terms of lower carbon intensity of pellets compared to coal-based electricity. I'm sort of out of time, but I just wanted to touch on one other thing, which is that given these concerns about indirect land use change, the regulation of this has taken the form where it's both for the renewable fuel standard as well as the California low carbon fuel standard. It's been basically mandated that they must account for both the direct and the indirect effect when they're considering the carbon intensity of a biofuel. And so what that's meant is that the carbon intensity of a biofuel would be its direct effect plus this indirect effect, and that's how sort of the policy is structured. So what that typically, we were interested in looking at what the economic effects of that are. So, and how much carbon gets abated when you add on this ILUC factor, which is this indirect effect. And so in order to do that, it's important to think that the way that these policies work, although it's not transparent, but these biofuel policies are implicitly subsidizing biofuel, and they're implicitly taxing gasoline. And so when we include this ILUC factor as an additional element in that calculation, it is lowering this implicit subsidy on biofuels, and it's raising the implicit tax on, it's raising the implicit carbon price of meeting these policy targets, and because it basically makes all biofuels dirtier. And so they become more carbon intensive, becomes more costly to try to meet that same standard now, and so it raises the cost of blending these biofuels with fuel prices, with fossil fuels, and raises fuel prices for consumers. So we did a welfare calculation, and sort of just get to the punchline of this. We did a welfare calculation of what that translates into in terms of the effect on fuel consumers, fuel producers. It has an effect on agricultural consumers because, of course, it shifts demand away from fuels like corn ethanol towards more low carbon fuels. So this is sort of looking at over a period of 2007, 2027, which shift away demand towards cellulosic biofuels and so on. So that, and of course the effects will differ depending on which ILUC factors that you're using. And so we did this analysis using estimates used by EPA, by the California Resources Board, and then also the numbers used by Searchinger, which are of course very extreme and therefore lead to a very extreme effect. And you can see that just the fact of including that ILUC factor imposes a net cost of $35 billion to $211 billion over this time period, added up over consumers and producers in the ag and forestry sectors. And so, and the net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is relatively small. It ranges between 1% to 3%, whereas the cost is pretty high. And so on a per ton basis, that translates into a cost of abating these indirect effects that ranges between $60 per ton to $186 per ton, depending on which estimates one is using. Compare that to the social cost of carbon, which is about $50 per metric ton with the 3% discount rate that we had assumed. And so these costs of abating these unintended effects are about 20 to 270% higher than what we estimate to be the monetary value of the damages due to those greenhouse gas emissions. And so one has to really question whether this is an effective way to control these unintended effects. So let me just conclude. It's important to recognize that ILUC effects, are there, but they are dynamic. They're changing over time, and they are smaller than estimated previously by studies for a variety of reasons: model improvement, data improvement, and so on. And across a range of studies, you could sort of see that they're not large enough to negate the benefits in terms of greenhouse gas savings that one gets from biofuels. Also, the current approach, at least to try to address these using this ILUC factor, is really not a cost-effective way to control the unintended effects of biofuels. A variety of other approaches possibly could be used and should be investigated in addition, such as incentivizing low ILUC biofuels, perennial grasses that could be grown on marginal land, and moving away from food-based biofuels. Shifting towards performance-based policies like a low-carbon fuel standard instead of a renewable fuel standard is another approach to try to shift away from food crop to low-carbon fuels. Certifying low ILUC biofuels and trying to have direct regulations to restrict land use change. So stop with that. Sorry for going over.